Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to look at Revelation chapter 13, the beast out of the sea. To me, this is one of the great studies of the Bible. Looking forward to that time when this monster will rise upon the world scene. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the beast out of the sea.
And J.R., let's begin by reading Revelation 13, verses 1 and 2. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. Now, J.R., this is maybe the pinnacle metaphor in the entire Bible. This encompasses so much of the Bible in 2 verses. It's an incredible symbol.
Yes. In fact, on today's program, we probably will not get past these 2 verses, but we'll have to defer to our next program to continue through this incredible chapter. Now, I want you to notice something about these chapters. First of all, this beast has the name of blasphemy, and the dragon gives him his power. We see here the epitome of evil. So notice, please, it's in chapter number 13. 13, historically and in the Bible, is very definitely the number of sin and shame and rebellion against God. It is the number of evil, so to speak. Well, there are 18 verses in this 13th chapter. 18 is made up of 6 plus 6 plus 6. And so, Gary, we have God's stamp upon this as saying this is the epitome of evil here.
Evil, and as, by the way, as E.W. Bollinger puts it, he calls the number 13 specifically the number of rebellion. And that's what we have here, rebellion against God in a gigantic, unlimited human government that does everything it can to unseat and untrack God's plan for planet Earth. And this goes all the way back to a prophecy in Genesis 3:15, where the Lord cursed the serpent, and he says, "And I will put enmity between thee," that is the serpent, "and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Of course, we all think of that as the earliest of the messianic prophecies, the bruising of the heel of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the wounding of the head of the serpent. But J.R., we have to come up here to Revelation to get the full view of that serpent. Here he is in absolutely full flower as a kind of a global manifestation.
We are talking here about the world government and its leader, the Antichrist. Obviously, then, the first reference to the Antichrist is in Genesis 3:15. He is the seed of the serpent. And this idea of rebellion against God and the nations getting together, those animals, for example, the lion, the bear, the leopard, they are symbols of modern nations. I think of England. I think of the bear of Russia. I think of the leopard of Germany. And so these entities that have given, in the 20th century, given the world such heartache, are getting together now. We see the United Nations getting together. Listen to the Psalms in Psalm 2, which says, "The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us." Gary, that's exactly what has happened in this century,
Yes.
in this past century, as the nations have gotten together and decided they don't need God. We want the utopia that man has longed for so many centuries. We want to put it together, but we don't need God to do it.
And J.R., the 20th century, and we should remind everybody, it's easy to forget that we're now living in the 21st century. Back in the old days, the 20th century, that was a century in which the beginning, J.R., I think God was fairly universally acknowledged in the lives, particularly of people here in the United States, but also in Europe. People understood the value of going to church. They understood the value of worship, and they pretty much accepted the idea of biblical truth and morality. But through the 20th century, that idea became overturned to the point that nobody wants to acknowledge God now. And this is the setup for that global power structure.
Indeed. Now, the Bible in the Old Testament gives us several types and symbols of this man of sin, this Antichrist. By the way, John gave us the name Antichrist in his first epistle, chapter 2, verse 18, when he said, "Little children, you've heard that Antichrist shall come." And though he does not use the word Antichrist here in chapter 13 of Revelation, it is obvious that he is referring to this world leader that will come and try to conquer the world and rule for at least the last half of the tribulation period. In history, there have been certain stories that have spoken of this seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. Christ versus Antichrist. I think it can be seen in the stories of Cain and Abel. Mm-hmm. I think we can see it in Isaac and Ishmael. I think we can see this story in Jacob and Esau, the good and evil. I think we can see it in Moses versus Balaam. I think we can see it in Jesus versus Judas Iscariot. And these in many other ways. And by the way, some of the potentates of history have also been pictures of the Antichrist. I think of Pharaoh, the tyrant Pharaoh is certainly typical of the Antichrist. I think of Nebuchadnezzar, who conquered Jerusalem and destroyed Solomon's temple. I think of Belshazzar, who took the vessels of the temple and desecrated them with a big party and died that night. I think of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who sacrificed a pig on the altar at Jerusalem at the temple in AD 168, I believe it was. I think of Nero, who was the potentate of Rome, the emperor of Rome, who massacred many Christians, including Peter, had him crucified, and the Apostle Paul, Nero had him beheaded. And so we certainly see, and by the way, you know, in the first century, a lot of people believed Nero was the Antichrist. Even up until the 5th century, people have written that Nero will return someday to be the Antichrist. So there are a lot of precedents for the beast that we see here rise up out of the sea of nations.
And Jared, with specific reference to this sea of nations, let's begin with the first phrase in the Revelation passage, where in Revelations 13, John says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea." That sea is a metaphor for the great swirling, boiling, churning mass of humanity throughout history. And it's a great metaphor, but there's an interesting grammatic footnote having to do with this first sentence, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea." And by the way, J.R. discusses this in quite a bit of detail in his article that appears in the February issue of Prophecy in the News. J.R., let's talk about that first sentence.
You know, the fact that the beast rises up out of a tumultuous sea, the sea is swirling, that is the very epitome of rebellion, of which the number 13 speaks. And this beast, or this, I stood on the sand of the sea, the Greek word here that is translated in the King James Version, "I stood," is actually a word that should be translated "he stood." And so what John is seeing here is the dragon is cast out of heaven in chapter 12, and he pursues Israel, the woman, and then he comes to the seashore and calls this beast up out of the sea. Now this beast is already there. It's been there for a while, but he gives it new life and new impetus. And this dragon that calls up the beast is the devil himself. Now, this is a fascinating possibility, the concept of how this could come about. We had talked in programs past about the possibility that when the dragon is cast out of heaven with his angels, that suddenly all these UFOs that the demons have been flying and been blinking in and out of this dimension could suddenly blink in and can't go back out again, and they're stuck here in our atmosphere. At which time, I think the devil would have to say, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Plan B. And he begins to tell everybody on planet Earth that they need to get the United Nations together and revive this idea of world government. Well, I tell you, there's a lot here. And we've got, in fact, I want to discuss this some more in just a few moments. We're going to break away for a moment, and we'll be right back, so don't go away. The beast rises up out of the sea because the dragon stands on the seashore and calls him forth. Now, bear in mind that this beast out of the sea has a deadly wound in its head, which means it's dead in the water. But this dragon revives it. Now, I can see, Gary, the UFOs coming, and they're calling themselves our space brothers. And it's a good idea, he would say, that you revive this world government. In fact, you remember the movie Independence Day?
Oh, yes.
When over all of the capitals of the world, these huge spacecraft manned by demons,
oh, yes.
demonic-looking creatures, dragon-like creatures, scared the whole world into getting together.
Yeah.
And this may be a part of the concept here that we need to get together and face our enemy, so to speak.
Well, Jerry, you're talking about culture colliding with history, colliding with mythology. I don't think you have to scratch very deeply under the skin of man to find an intrinsic belief in demons and demonology. And, of course, all of this UFO mythology right now is nothing more than demonology in the disguise of the astronauts, so that it fits with our contemporary thinking. But all of that is under the control of the old serpent. And it's interesting to point out at this time, J.R. mentioned a minute ago, that this serpent, Revelation 13, is not being created at the time of Revelation 13. He's always existed, but he's being called up at that time. And J.R., this matches perfectly with Hebrew history, because Hebrew history has the story, which is told annually. It's usually recited by a rabbi to the children, telling the story of Leviathan, the great serpent under the sea, which has lurked there for centuries and which is the enemy of Israel, but which will in the end of days be called up and destroyed by a messianic figure. And the skin of Leviathan will be pulled out and dried and used to make hundreds of useful objects. And so they celebrate the death of Leviathan in Jewish lore. Well, where did they get this idea? It's a biblical idea.
Yes, indeed. In fact, the first great creature that God made in the days of creation was the whale, or actually the Hebrew word for it could more likely be translated Leviathan. Listen to Psalm 104, for example. In Psalm 104, verse 26, the psalmist writes, "There go the ships, there is that Leviathan whom thou hast made to play therein." So the idea of the Leviathan, or the dragon in the sea, is certainly steeped back in the history of Israel's folklore.
And now moving quickly, and we have to move quickly because the clock is spinning. When we go back to Daniel chapter 7, we have a kind of a foreview of Revelation 13. Daniel 7:2 says, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea. Well, here is a picture of wind blowing back and forth across the sea. Again, we have this picture of the sea of the nations, the waves, the white caps, the tumult. Again, it's a picture of the people in rebellion. Why did the heathen rage? It says in Psalm 2. Here's the raging of the sea. And then, J.R., we have some monsters that come up out of that sea in Daniel chapter 7.
Indeed. The first one, of course, is the lion. And there are so many symbols for the lion. You know, a winged lion was found on the walls of Ashurbanipal's palace in Nineveh, and another on the palace in Susa, which is a little community just across the Babylonian border in Persia. Mm-hmm. And so ancient Persia had the symbol. It must have been prevalent in Daniel's day. In fact, Jewish archaeologists have suggested that this is a cherub.
Yes, very much a power
lion.
figure, and it makes sense that pagan people would take what is a sacred symbol to the Jews and kind of, if you will, capitalize on it, use it as their power symbol. But
yes, you know, around the throne there was a lion, and an eagle, and a man and an ox. So these are the cherubim around the throne of God, and so this is one reason why the winged lion was a symbol of an angelic creature.
So Daniel says the first of these beasts came up out of the sea, was like a lion, had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, made to stand upon the feet as a man. A man's heart or a man's thinking was given to it. And J.R., that's an amazing symbol. A lot of people say, well, maybe that's an ancient symbol for an ancient country. It could be a 20th century symbol.
Indeed it could. You know, we can't really put our finger on one particular translation and say this, or one particular concept and say this is what it is. You remember, for example, over in chapter 17, when they look at the beast and they see the 7 heads, we're told the 7 heads are 7 hills upon which the woman sits. And then he goes on to say, and, by the way, and there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen and 1 is, and so on. In other words, there's more than one way to look at this lion with eagle's wings. Let's take the lion, for example, as being the symbol of Great Britain. And the eagle's wings, it was Great Britain who, in the Balfour Declaration, promised that Israel would be allowed to go back home to their promised land.
Well, if you look at the English, who became the Americans, who acquired the eagle as their symbol, and then if that whole conglomerate, that historical development that involved America and England, World Wars I and II, and the Balfour Declaration, the heart of a man being given to the lion, this could very well be the pronouncement that gave Israel the land.
Yes. And the eagle's wings could be a representation of the United States, whose symbol is an eagle. On the other hand, you know, Israel was brought back home on eagle's wings. God said that they were, and that they would be. Mm-hmm. And so it's possible that the return of the Jews, the Lion of Judah, this is a symbol of Israel today, has been deposited back on their terra firma, their own holy land, by eagle's wings. So we see Israel back in their land and ready for the last days.
Now, in verse 5 of Daniel 7, there is another beast, a second, like a bear. It's lying on one side, has 3 ribs in its teeth, and after that, Daniel sees a leopard with 4 wings on its back. J.R., these two could be 20th century symbols, and everybody knows about the bear.
Yes, the bear of Russia. And of course, the fact that it has 3 ribs in its mouth, that's mean.
It is.
Yeah, it's a mean bear. And we know that the lion has a man's heart given to it. That's not so bad, you know? That's pretty nice.
Yes.
And we can see this in the differences between England and Russia. And then, of course, the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. It could be Germany, because you may recall Hitler headed up the Third Reich, but Germany promises a fourth Reich.
That's true. And then Daniel sees in Daniel 7:7 a fourth beast, great, terrible, and strong. And J.R., bringing it all back home in just a few seconds we have left, you go back to Revelation 13, and here is this beast out of the sea. It's like a leopard. His feet are like the feet of a bear. His mouth's like the mouth of a lion. We revisit those beasts that we saw in Daniel.
Yes, and I think that all these nations are now getting together in what we call the United Nations to establish a new world order. The problem is nobody's willing to cede their sovereignty to the UN. That's not going to come until the devil forces everybody to come under a one world government. That's the way I see it. And of course, there's so much involved here. We'll have to tell you more on our next program. We'll be back in just a moment.
I'd like to talk to you for a moment about an exciting new offer from Prophecy in the News. And that offer is the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary. Beautifully bound, beautifully produced, top-notch scholarship, and every page of these 4 volumes covering Matthew to Revelation is in full 4-color process. You're going to find an amazing array of maps, charts, artists' conceptions, sidebars, easy to read study aids, and as I said, the scholarship. Well, Clinton Arnold, the general editor, Talbot School of Theology, you're going to find the Bible interpretation right on the mark. Now, this is different from anything Zondervan has done before. Well, let's look, for example, at Volume 1, page 172. Now, this is the Matthew study, and you'll find in here the story of the crucifixion of Christ at this point. But you'll also find a picture of the potter's field, Akeldama. You'll also find a sidebar about Barabbas and the thieves who were crucified with Christ, talking about the cultural ferment of the day, the fact that those thieves were really revolutionaries. You're also going to find a sidebar about the life of Pontius Pilate, including, by the way, the famous Pontius Pilate inscription, a photograph of that. In short, you're going to receive a broad background, all the subjects that impinge upon the crucifixion of Christ. That's what's meant by Bible Backgrounds Commentary. Now, normally the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary retails for $159.95. At Prophecy in the News, we're going to make it available to you for only $134.95, and as an added inducement to ordering right now, we're going to include a free bonus, and that is the 3 VHS videotape set right in front of me. It's called Deciphering Daniel. It contains 12 studies, one for each of the 12 chapters of Daniel. It's an exciting study, and JR and I go into depth in these 3 VHS videotapes. Normally $49.95, yours absolutely free. Plus, we're going to also give you a free subscription, 1-year subscription to Prophecy in the News, our monthly magazine, and that would be valued at $29.95 altogether. This would be a $240 value, yours for only the price of the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary, and that's $134.95. This Zondervan publication is brand new. It's something very, very timely. Order today. Call the number on your screen right now.
Well, as you can see, this subject is so vast. In our February magazine, I spent 7,500 words on these first 2 verses alone, Gary.
JR, you just don't know when to quit.
That's right.
But basically, the 13th chapter of Revelation is, let's put it this way, it's the one everybody talks about. It's the Antichrist chapter. It's the Mark of the Beast chapter. It's the 666 chapter. We've got so much more to say, but you'll have to join us again.
I have a feeling we'll be on it all month.
I think so.
If you'd like to have the February magazine, free by the way, normally sells for $2.95, just call the phone number at the bottom of your screen and ask for it, and you can read all about Daniel Daniel chapter 7, and Revelation chapter 13. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.
Prophecy in the News is a viewer-supported ministry sponsored by our many friends across America and in your area. For your gift of $10, you can receive a special edition of our current program on audio tape, or for a gift of $20, we'll send you our programs on videotape. For either order, call the 800 number on your screen right now.